The runway lights of Rostov-on-Don pierced through the darkness and rain like beacons of hope. After hours of circling through violent storms, the crew of FlyDubai Flight 981 was finally approaching their destination. The 62 people on board, exhausted passengers returning from vacation and a weary flight crew, just wanted to land and end this difficult journey. But as the Boeing 737 descended through the turbulent skies on that early morning of March 19, 2016, the pilots faced a critical decision. Ahead of them lay deadly windshear, behind them stretched hours of holding patterns, and below them waited a runway they'd already attempted to reach once before. What happened in the next few minutes would become one of modern aviation's most studied accidents. A cascading series of events where confusion, fatigue, and split-second decisions transformed a routine go-around into an uncontrollable dive into the ground. This is the complete story of FlyDubai Flight 981, an accident that would expose critical gaps in pilot training and forever change how airlines prepare their crews for high-stress situations. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand FlyDubai itself. Established in 2008 as a low-cost carrier owned by the government of Dubai, FlyDubai was part of the Emirates' ambitious plan to diversify its aviation sector beyond the luxury market dominated by Emirates Airlines. While Emirates focused on long-haul international routes with premium service, FlyDubai targeted underserved regional destinations across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. The airline grew explosively in its first 8 years. By 2016, FlyDubai operated a fleet of over 50 Boeing 737-800 aircraft, serving more than 95 destinations. This rapid expansion created challenges. The airline needed to hire pilots quickly, recruiting experienced aviators from around the world. This international crew base brought diverse flying experience but also created teams where pilots often flew together for the first time, without the familiarity that develops over repeated pairings. FlyDubai's route network included many challenging airports, places with short runways, mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather, and limited navigation aids. Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia was one such destination. The city of over 1 million people had become an important hub connecting Russia's south to the Gulf region, but its airport posed unique challenges that would prove critical on the night of March 18, 2016. In the cockpit that evening sat two men with impressive aviation credentials, yet they had never flown together before. This wasn't unusual at FlyDubai or in the industry generally. Airline procedures are designed so pilots can work effectively regardless of prior familiarity. But as events would prove, crew coordination becomes even more critical when things go wrong. Captain Aristos Socrates, 37 years old, was a Cypriot national with nearly 6,000 flight hours. His career had taken him across multiple airlines and continents. He'd flown for Helios Airways in Cyprus from 2004 until the airline ceased operations in 2006 following the tragic crash of Flight 522, an accident caused by pressurization problems that had killed all 121 people on board. That disaster had shaken the entire Cypriot aviation community, and Socrates had moved on to UK-based XL Airways, where he flew from 2006 to 2008. After XL Airways collapsed during the 2008 financial crisis, Socrates joined Malaysia Airlines, flying from 2011 to 2012 before making his way to FlyDubai in 2014. This pattern of moving between airlines wasn't unusual in the post-2008 aviation industry, where airline failures and restructurings were common. Each move brought new aircraft types, new procedures, new cultures. By March 2016, Socrates was just days away from leaving FlyDubai for Ryanair, a move that would allow him to return home to Cyprus and live with his family. This would be among his final flights for the airline, a detail that adds poignancy to the tragedy but doesn't appear to have played any role in the accident itself. The first officer, 35-year-old Alejandro Cruz Alava from Spain, brought similar experience, just under 6,000 flight hours, including substantial time on various aircraft types. He'd flown ATR-72 turboprops and Airbus A320s before joining FlyDubai to fly the Boeing 737-800. Like Socrates, he'd been with FlyDubai for about 2 years. Both pilots had good overall records, but their recent training evaluations revealed some concerns. During their biannual recurrent training, the simulator sessions all airline pilots undergo to maintain proficiency, both had shown deficiencies in certain areas. Socrates had struggled with manual flying precision during some exercises. Alava had needed extra training on certain procedures. These weren't major failures, both had ultimately passed their checks, but they indicated areas where skills could be sharper. More significantly, neither pilot had ever flown into Rostov-on-Don before. This was their first visit to an airport that FlyDubai had designated as captain-only due to its challenges. An unusually shallow glide slope of just 2.67 degrees instead of the standard 3 degrees, frequent turbulence and wind shear on approach, and the general complexities of flying in Russia. Flying into Russia presented unique challenges that added to the crew's workload. Unlike most of the world, Russian air traffic control measures altitudes in meters rather than feet, requiring pilots to constantly convert between the two systems. Controllers also use a different altimeter setting system. Instead of setting altimeters to show height above sea level, the standard almost everywhere else, Russian controllers give settings that make altimeters show height above the airport itself. These differences create opportunities for errors, especially for pilots unfamiliar with the system. A mistake in setting the altimeter or converting between meters and feet could mean flying hundreds of feet above or below where you think you are. For Alava, the first officer, this was his first experience with these Russian peculiarities. Socrates had flown into Russia 14 times before, but even that experience couldn't eliminate all the challenges. The weather forecast for Rostov that night added another layer of complexity. Strong gusty winds, low clouds, rain, and, most ominously, severe turbulence and wind shear predicted from the surface up to 15,000 feet. Wind shear, a sudden change in wind speed or direction, is one of aviation's most feared phenomena. It can slam an aircraft toward the ground with little warning, and it has caused numerous disasters throughout aviation history. Modern aircraft like the Boeing 737-800 have sophisticated wind shear detection systems. The weather radar can detect wind shear ahead of the aircraft by measuring changes in the movement of water droplets, giving pilots advanced warning. The aircraft also has a reactive wind shear detection system that alerts pilots when they've already encountered wind shear. Both types of warning demand immediate action. Execute a wind shear escape maneuver and get away from the ground as quickly as possible. Departure. Everything seems routine. At 1837 local time on March 18, 2016, FlyDubai Flight 981 pushed back from its gate at Dubai International Airport. The Boeing 737-800, registration A6FDN, was loaded with 55 passengers and 7 crew members. Most passengers were Russian citizens returning home from package holidays in the warm Gulf. There were also 8 Ukrainians, 2 Indians, and 1 Uzbek national on board. The aircraft carried approximately 17 tons of fuel, far more than needed for the 4.5-hour flight to Rostov. This extra fuel served 2 purposes. It would be used for the return flight to Dubai, a practice called tankering done because fuel was cheaper in Dubai than Rostov, and it provided plenty of reserve for holding if weather required it. That extra fuel would prove prophetic. First Officer Alava occupied the right seat for departure, acting as pilot flying for the leg to Rostov. This was standard practice, pilots alternate legs with each taking turns flying while the other monitors. Upon arrival at Rostov, Captain Socrates would take over as pilot flying, as per FlyDubai's requirement that only captains land at this challenging airport. The departure from Dubai was smooth. After a 17-minute taxi through the complex web of taxiways at one of the world's busiest airports, Flight 981 lined up on the runway and accelerated into the warm night air. Alava hand-flew the aircraft to 2,700 feet before engaging the autopilot, which would fly the aircraft along its programmed route north toward Russia. In the cabin, flight attendants began their service. With only 55 passengers in an aircraft configured for over 180, the service went quickly. Passengers settled in for what they expected would be a routine overnight flight, arriving in Rostov around 1:20 a.m. local time. The Boeing 737-800 climbed to its cruising altitude of 36,000 feet and settled into the long cruise over the Persian Gulf, Iran, and eventually into Russian airspace. Captain Socrates used the flight time to familiarize himself with the Rostov approach, reviewing charts and procedures. He also turned on his heads-up display, HUD, a transparent screen that projects flight information in his line of sight, allowing him to see critical data while looking straight ahead rather than down at instruments. The HUD was a relatively new feature on commercial aircraft, borrowed from military fighter jets. It displayed airspeed, altitude, heading, the aircraft's flight path, and even wind information, all projected onto a glass screen position so the pilot could see through it to the runway while simultaneously seeing the data. For night approaches in bad weather, the HUD was invaluable. Socrates was experienced with it and appreciated its utility. As Flight 981 crossed into Russian airspace and began its descent toward Rostov, the crew's workload increased. They needed to coordinate with multiple air traffic controllers, review the latest weather information, brief the approach, and prepare for landing. And the weather news wasn't good. First approach, wind shear strikes. At approximately 0:41 a.m. on March 19th, Flight 981 contacted Rostov Approach Control. The controller passed along the current weather. Wind from 240 degrees at 17 knots, gusting to 29 knots. That's roughly 54 kilometers per hour with gusts, strong but manageable. There were rain showers, low clouds, and, most concerning, a SIGMET in effect. SIGMET stands for Significant Meteorological Information. It's issued when weather conditions pose a hazard to aircraft. This particular SIGMET warned of severe turbulence from the surface up to 15,000 feet across a wide area. Severe turbulence is rare, strong enough that pilots can temporarily lose control of the aircraft, where objects in the cabin become projectiles, where the aircraft structure itself is stressed. The pilots asked where exactly this severe turbulence was located. The controller's answer was not reassuring. It covered almost the entire area. However, he added that no aircraft had actually reported encountering it yet that night. Perhaps it was present but not as severe as forecast. Perhaps they'd get lucky. Captain Socrates took over as pilot flying and began the approach briefing, a systematic review of how they'd fly the approach, what altitudes and speeds they'd use, what actions they'd take in various scenarios. One critical element: if they had to go around, they would climb to 2,300 feet, 700 meters in the Russian system. This relatively low go-around altitude would later prove significant. As they descended toward Rostov, the pilots began encountering the predicted turbulence. The aircraft shook and buffeted as it flew through areas of unstable air. Rain pelted the windscreen. At approximately 1:07 a.m., Flight 981 was cleared for the ILS approach to runway 22. The autopilot intercepted the localizer, the lateral guidance beam, and turned the aircraft toward the runway. Then it captured the glide slope, the vertical guidance, and began descending along the 2.67-degree glide path toward the runway, still several miles ahead. The pilots configured the aircraft for landing. Flaps extended, landing gear down, speed reducing to approach speed. They calculated they needed to fly at 140 knots plus an 18-knot correction for the wind and gusts, giving a target approach speed of 158 knots. However, for reasons that remain unclear, they actually set their speed at only 150 knots, 8 knots less than they should have. This gave them less margin above stall speed than they should have had. The turbulence worsened as they descended below 5,000 feet. At about 1,200 feet above the ground, Captain Socrates disconnected the autopilot and began flying manually. The automation had been handling the approach perfectly, but Socrates wanted to get a feel for the aircraft in these conditions before the final moments of landing. This was good practice. Disconnecting the autopilot at the last second can leave pilots without sufficient time to adjust to hand flying. Through the clouds and rain, the runway lights finally appeared about 7 kilometers ahead. But just seconds later, at 1,100 feet, the aircraft's weather radar detected rapid changes in wind direction ahead. An automated voice suddenly blared through the cockpit. "Wind shear ahead! Wind shear ahead!" Captain Socrates reacted immediately, executing the wind shear escape maneuver exactly as trained. He slammed both thrust levers to the forward stop, commanding maximum thrust from the engines. He pulled back on the control column, pitching the nose up. The engines roared to full power, and everyone on board was pushed back into their seats as the aircraft accelerated and climbed steeply away from the ground. This was not a normal go-around. This was an emergency escape maneuver designed to get away from deadly wind shear as quickly as possible. The procedure calls for keeping the landing gear down and flaps extended, even though this creates drag, because the priority is climbing rapidly, not climbing efficiently. Every second closer to the ground increases the danger. First Officer Alava, following Socrates' instruction, notified air traffic control, going around. This took his attention away from monitoring the aircraft's flight path at a critical moment. With full thrust and a light aircraft, they'd burned fuel during the flight. The Boeing 737 climbed extremely rapidly. The target altitude was just 2,300 feet, only about 1,100 feet above their current position. At maximum thrust in a light aircraft, they would reach that altitude in seconds. Captain Socrates pushed forward on the control column, trying to prevent the nose from pitching up too steeply. The engines, mounted below and ahead of the wing, create a pitch-up moment when at high thrust. Their thrust line is below the aircraft's center of gravity, so they try to rotate the aircraft nose up. Socrates had to counteract this by pushing forward with significant force. The aircraft's speed increased rapidly, too rapidly. The first officer called out, "Watch your speed." Socrates acknowledged but didn't reduce thrust. The aircraft accelerated through the maximum speed for 30-degree flaps, 175 knots, and the flaps automatically retracted to 25 degrees as a protective measure built into the aircraft. Meanwhile, the aircraft shot through its target altitude of 2,300 feet. Socrates finally pulled the thrust levers back from maximum to about 83%, reducing acceleration and the pitch-up tendency. He was able to level off and stabilize the situation. The go-around had not been pretty. They'd gone too fast, climbed too quickly, overshot their altitude. But they'd accomplished the main goal. They'd gotten away from the wind shear and the ground. They were safe. Air traffic control cleared them to climb to 5,000 feet and gave them vectors for another approach or to enter a holding pattern. The decision to hold, waiting for conditions to improve. As Captain Socrates engaged the autopilot and retracted the flaps, he and First Officer Alava had to make a decision. Should they attempt another approach immediately? Should they divert to an alternate airport? Or should they hold and wait for conditions to improve? The wind shear warning had given them advance notice, allowing them to escape before entering the dangerous area. That was exactly what the system was designed to do. But wind shear was still present on the approach. If they tried again immediately, they'd likely get another warning. Maybe conditions would improve if they waited. Air traffic control informed them that an Aeroflot flight ahead of them was also making an approach. The pilots decided to hold at a navigation beacon and see what happened to the Aeroflot aircraft. If it landed successfully, that would indicate conditions had improved enough to try again. If it had to go around, they'd continue holding. Captain Socrates made a PA announcement to the passengers, apologizing for the delay and explaining they would hold until conditions improved. This was the safe, prudent decision. With over 9 tons of fuel remaining, they could hold for hours if necessary. As Flight 981 maneuvered toward the holding fix, air traffic control reported that the Aeroflot flight had gone around due to wind shear, so the wind shear wasn't clearing up. The pilots settled into a holding pattern while monitoring weather conditions. The holding pattern became an endurance test. Captain Socrates and First Officer Alava flew circuits around a navigation beacon, constantly adjusting their course to avoid the worst areas of severe weather visible on their weather radar. The strong winds complicated this task. Storms were moving quickly, and the pilots had to anticipate where they'd be, not just where they were currently. Icing was another threat. The combination of cold temperatures and high humidity meant ice could accumulate on the wings and engines, degrading performance or even causing engine failure. The pilots turned on anti-icing systems and requested clearance to climb to 8,000 feet to get above the worst icing conditions. Reports continued to come from air traffic control. The Aeroflot flight had attempted another approach and gone around again due to wind shear. Then a third attempt. 3 go-arounds in about an hour, all because of persistent wind shear on the approach path. This should have been a clear signal that conditions were not improving, that the wind shear was established and persistent, not transient. But Captain Socrates, reviewing the weather reports, saw some improvement in other parameters, Visibility was getting better, winds were moderating slightly. The overall trend seemed positive, even though the wind shear remained. The pressure to complete the flight. As Flight 981 continued holding, now for over an hour, various pressures began weighing on the captain's decision-making. The most obvious was the passengers. They'd been in the air for over 6 hours now, including nearly 2 hours of holding in turbulence. They were tired, frustrated, anxious. They'd paid to get to Rostov, and Rostov was right there, just a few miles away. The captain could see the runway during his first approach. It was so close. From an operational standpoint, diverting would create enormous complications. FlyDubai would need to arrange overnight accommodation for 55 passengers and 7 crew in a different city, then arrange ground transportation to get everyone to Rostov. The aircraft would need to be repositioned to Rostov for its scheduled return flight to Dubai. All of this would be expensive and would likely cause delays that would ripple through the airline schedule for days. The alternate airport was Volgograd, about 200 nautical miles northeast. But as the holding continued, FlyDubai's operations center suggested Mineralny Vody Airport, 270 nautical miles southeast, as a better alternate with more stable weather. They filed a flight plan for Mineralny Vody and provided the route, estimated flight time, 44 minutes, and fuel required, 1.7 tons. The airline's recommendation: hold as long as possible and try to make it into Rostov if you can. Only divert if absolutely necessary. This wasn't pressure to do something unsafe. Diversion was always an option, and FlyDubai's operations center wasn't ordering the captain to land in Rostov at all costs. But it established what everyone wanted: completion of the flight to the intended destination. And with hours of holding fuel available, there was no immediate urgency to divert. Captain Socrates contacted the airline via satellite communication and discussed the situation. He told them he'd seen the runway on the first approach, and though the wind shear warning had forced him to go around, he felt the approach should have been doable. He agreed with the recommendation to hold as long as possible and try another approach when conditions improved. The pilots reviewed charts for Mineralny Vody, programmed the route into their flight management computer, and discussed the approach procedures. Everything was ready for a diversion if needed. Just a few button presses would send the aircraft there. But landing at Rostov remained their strong preference. After over 90 minutes of holding, Captain Socrates decided conditions had improved enough to try another approach. Weather reports showed slightly better conditions. The wind shear might have been transient. Many aircraft had landed at Rostov that night without incident. It was just bad luck that the wind shear had been present during their first attempt and during the Aeroflot aircraft's attempts. At 3:28 a.m., over 4.5 hours after taking off from Dubai, after nearly 2 hours of holding, Flight 981 began descending for a second approach to runway 22 at Rostov-on-Don. Second approach, configuration and confusion. This time, several things were different. The pilots were more careful with their calculations. At their current weight of 54 tons, they'd burned several tons of fuel during holding. They calculated a base approach speed of 133 knots. Adding the full 20-knot wind correction, they arrived at an approach speed of 153 knots, the proper speed this time. They also requested a change to the go-around procedure. Instead of climbing to just 2,300 feet if they had to go around, they asked to climb to 8,000 feet. Air traffic control approved. This gave them more altitude to work with and wouldn't require them to level off so quickly. As they descended below 10,000 feet, they encountered the turbulence again. The aircraft shook and bounced through unstable air. In the cabin, passengers, many of whom had dozed off during the holding, were now wide awake, gripping armrests as the aircraft jolted and swayed. At 5,000 feet, Captain Socrates reviewed the wind shear escape maneuver with First Officer Alava again. They'd just performed it less than 2 hours ago, but reviewing procedures keeps them fresh in mind. If they got a wind shear warning again, they'd be ready. Flight 981 intercepted the localizer and began tracking toward runway 22. The autopilot captured the glide slope and began the descent along the shallow 2.67-degree path. Flaps extended, gear down, speed reducing to 153 knots. Everything was stable. At about 2,200 feet, Captain Socrates disconnected the autopilot as he'd done before, taking manual control. A few moments later, he also disconnected the autothrottle, taking manual control of thrust as well. He was flying the approach by hand, using his heads-up display to see the flight path and guidance cues overlaid on his forward view. Through the HUD, Socrates could see the flight path symbol, a representation of where the aircraft was actually going through space, and the guidance cue showing where he should put that flight path symbol. By keeping the flight path symbol centered on the guidance cue, he could fly a perfect approach. The approach was stable. Socrates was slightly fast at times, but within acceptable limits. The turbulence continued, causing the speed to fluctuate as gusts hit the aircraft. At one point, Socrates noticed he was getting slightly high on the glide slope, above the desired path. He pushed the nose down slightly to correct back down to the glide path. But simultaneously, he also pushed the thrust levers forward, adding power. This combination, nose down plus power increase, caused the speed to jump. A gust of wind hit the aircraft at that moment, and the airspeed leaped from 153 knots to 168 knots in 1 second, then to 176 knots over the next 2 seconds. First Officer Alava immediately called out, "Check the speed!" This was far too fast. The approach was no longer stable. A stable approach requires maintaining speed within certain limits, and they'd exceeded those limits. Standard operating procedures required a go-around when an approach became unstable. Captain Socrates immediately called, "Go around!" He pushed the thrust levers to maximum power and began pulling back on the control column to pitch the nose up and climb away from the runway. This was a reasonable decision. The approach had become unstable, so executing a go-around was correct. But what happened next would turn this routine maneuver into a catastrophic loss of control. The fatal confusion. Which maneuver? Captain Socrates had just declared a go-around, but he hadn't clearly communicated which type of go-around he intended to execute. There are 2 different procedures. Normal go-around, used when the approach is unstable for reasons like being too fast, too high, or unable to see the runway. The procedure involves maximum thrust, pitch up to climb, positive rate of climb confirmed, retract gear, retract flaps to 15 degrees, accelerate and climb away. Windshear escape maneuver, used specifically when wind shear is detected or encountered. The procedure involves maximum thrust, pitch up aggressively to 15 degrees, keep gear and flaps in their current configuration, don't retract them. Climb away as rapidly as possible, ignoring speed. The key difference is the configuration. Normal go-around involves retracting gear and flaps to reduce drag and allow efficient climbing. Wind shear escape keeps everything extended because the priority is climbing immediately, not efficiently. Captain Socrates had just briefed the wind shear escape maneuver minutes earlier. He'd executed it on the first approach. The sudden speed increase that prompted this go-around could be interpreted as wind shear, a sudden gust that increased airspeed. In Socrates' mind, this appeared to be wind shear, so the wind shear escape maneuver was appropriate. But he didn't explicitly tell First Officer Alava, "Wind shear escape maneuver," or "Keep the gear and flaps extended." He simply called "Go around." From Alava's perspective, he'd just called out that the speed was too high, a violation of stable approach criteria that requires a normal go-around. There'd been no wind shear warning from the aircraft. This looked like a normal go-around for an unstable approach. As the engine spooled to maximum thrust and the aircraft began climbing, Alava asked, "Flaps 15. This was the standard call for a normal go-around. Retract flaps from 30 degrees, landing configuration, to 15 degrees, go-around configuration. Socrates, busy with controlling the aircraft and perhaps not fully processing the significance of the question, replied, "Yes." This was the first critical error. By agreeing to retract flaps to 15 degrees, Socrates was deviating from standard procedures in multiple ways. It was the pilot monitoring's, Alava's, role to call for flap changes only during a normal go-around, not a wind shear escape maneuver. The pilot flying, Socrates, should be the one to call for configuration changes, not agree to them suggested by the other pilot. If this was truly a wind shear escape maneuver, flaps should stay at 30 degrees. Alava then called positive rate, meaning the aircraft was climbing, which prompted Socrates to call gear up. The landing gear retracted. Now they were in a hybrid configuration that didn't match either procedure. They had the engines at maximum thrust, correct for both procedures, but they'd retracted the gear and set flaps to 15 degrees, correct for normal go-around but wrong for wind shear escape. This reduced the drag significantly. The aircraft was now more streamlined than during the first go-around. With maximum thrust, lightweight, and reduced drag, the Boeing 737 began accelerating and climbing extremely rapidly. Much more rapidly than Captain Socrates expected or was prepared for. Loss of control. The aircraft gets away from the pilot. The engines at maximum thrust created a strong pitch-up moment, the tendency for the nose to rise. Captain Socrates had to push forward on the control column with significant force to prevent the nose from pitching up too steeply. He was pushing with his left hand while his right hand held the thrust levers at maximum power. The target was to maintain a pitch attitude of 15 degrees nose up, the standard for go-around climbs. But with the aircraft accelerating so rapidly and climbing so quickly, Socrates struggled to maintain consistent pitch. The nose rose to 18 degrees. He pushed forward to bring it down. The nose dropped to just 4 degrees above the horizon. This created momentary negative G-forces. Everyone on board briefly became weightless as the climb slowed. Objects lifted off surfaces. The pilots were raised slightly out of their seats against their shoulder harnesses. Captain Socrates' right hand, which was holding the thrust levers forward, moved back involuntarily during this weightless moment, briefly reducing thrust before he pushed the levers forward again. But the real issue was that Socrates had mentally fallen behind the aircraft. Instead of positively controlling the pitch, he was reacting to it. Seeing it rise, pushing down. Seeing it fall, pulling up. The aircraft was flying him rather than him flying the aircraft. First Officer Alava, watching the instruments, urged, 15 degrees pitch. Socrates raised the nose back up, but then overcorrected again, pushing it down too far. The pitch oscillated, 18 degrees, 4 degrees, back up, back down. Wild swings that created uncomfortable G-forces and indicated a pilot struggling to maintain control. Meanwhile, nobody was paying attention to airspeed. The aircraft rocketed through 200 knots, the maximum speed for flaps 15. The automatic flap protection system activated, retracting the flaps from 15 degrees to 10 degrees. Neither pilot noticed this. They were both fixated on pitch attitude, suffering from tunnel vision brought on by stress and cognitive overload. With flaps now at only 10 degrees and engines still at maximum thrust, the aircraft accelerated even faster. The Boeing 737 climbed through 3,300 feet, its speed now 210 knots and increasing. All Captain Socrates needed to do was reduce thrust, pull the throttles back from maximum to a more appropriate setting. But he didn't. His attention remained locked on pitch control, on preventing the nose from rising too high. To reduce the force he needed to apply on the control column, Socrates reached for the stabilizer trim switches, 2 small switches on the control wheel that adjust the horizontal stabilizer. Trimming the stabilizer would reduce the push force required. But he held the switches down for 12 seconds, an abnormally long time. The horizontal stabilizer, the large surface at the tail of the aircraft, began rotating to push the tail up and the nose down. Trim is supposed to be used to maintain pitch changes made with the elevators, not to make pitch changes themselves. Pilots are trained to use the control column to establish the pitch they want, then trim to maintain that pitch with the column in neutral. But Socrates was doing the opposite. He was pushing the control column forward, which deflects the elevators to push the nose down, while also trimming nose down, which rotates the entire stabilizer to push the nose down. Both systems working together to push the nose down, far more than necessary. The aircraft transitioned from a climb to a descent. Then the descent steepened. Objects in the cockpit lifted up. Loose papers, dust, debris. As the aircraft went over the top, the pilots experienced 0 G, then negative G as the descent steepened further. They hung in their shoulder harnesses as the aircraft pitched down, down, down. The nose dropped through the horizon, now pointed below level flight. It continued dropping, 10 degrees nose down, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The aircraft was now in a screaming dive toward the ground, engines still at maximum thrust, accelerating past 250 knots, past 300 knots. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000, 1,500. Dust and debris swirled through the cockpit, flung up by the negative G-forces. It filled the pilot's eyes and noses, making it difficult to see and breathe. The physical forces were unlike anything either pilot had experienced in their careers. Captain Socrates became completely disoriented. He began pressing the rudder pedals left and right, a reflexive action that served no purpose. The aircraft's rate of descent reached 18,000 feet per minute, 20 times the normal descent rate on approach. At this rate, they had less than 20 seconds until impact. First Officer Alava, watching the instruments in horror, shouted, "Pull up! Pull up!" But Socrates, overwhelmed by stress and physical forces, couldn't hear him or couldn't process what he was saying. The ground proximity warning system activated, its synthetic voice urgently commanding, "Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!" At the last moment, some survival instinct kicked in. Captain Socrates yanked the control column hard to the left. The aircraft rolled into a steep left bank as it continued diving. First Officer Alava, recognizing the disaster unfolding, pulled back on his own control column, trying to override Socrates' input. But it was too late. They were out of altitude, out of time, out of options. At 3:50 a.m. on March 19, 2016, FlyDubai Flight 981 slammed into runway 22 at Rostov-on-Don Airport at over 600 kilometers per hour in a 50-degree nose-down, banked attitude. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, scattering wreckage across hundreds of meters of runway and adjoining grass. A massive fireball erupted as the fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. All 62 people on board, 55 passengers and 7 crew, were killed instantly. The investigation. The Interstate Aviation Committee, IAC, Russia's Aviation Accident Investigation Authority, launched an immediate investigation. The wreckage was secured. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered and analyzed, and investigators began the painstaking work of understanding what had happened. The physical evidence told a clear story. The aircraft had struck the runway in a steep dive at high speed. There was no indication of mechanical failure, no evidence of engine problems or structural issues before impact. This had been a controlled flight into terrain, an aircraft under power with functioning systems, flown into the ground by the pilots. But why? What had caused 2 experienced pilots to lose control during what should have been a routine go-around? The 62 people who died that night, Captain Aristos Socrates, First Officer Alejandro Cruz Alava, the 5 flight attendants and the 55 passengers, did not die in vain. Their tragedy has led to changes that have prevented similar accidents and saved countless lives. This is aviation's pact with those lost in accidents. We will learn from every tragedy, we will implement every lesson, and we will never stop working to make flight safer. It's a pact that has made commercial aviation the safest form of transportation ever devised by humanity, even as we acknowledge that perfection remains forever out of reach. As Flight 981 demonstrated, the margin between a safe flight and a catastrophe can be measured in seconds, in miscommunications, in small decisions made under stress and fatigue. The industry's response, comprehensive training improvements, procedure changes, and technological enhancements, represents aviation's determination to widen that margin, to give pilots more tools and better preparation for when things go wrong. The lights of Rostov-on-Don still guide aircraft to safe landings every night. Pilots still face challenging weather, strong winds, and the decision of whether to attempt an approach or divert. But they do so with better training, better procedures, and the hard-won knowledge purchased with the lives of those aboard FlyDubai Flight 981. Their memory lives on not just in the hearts of those who love them, but in every safe landing, every successful go-around, every pilot who makes the conservative choice because the lessons of March 19, 2016 have been thoroughly learned. That is their legacy. That is how we honor them. And that is why aviation, despite its occasional tragedies, continues to be a miracle of safety, because we learn, we improve, and we never forget. Retriclaude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.